They called him the Herald of Doom, the voice of destiny, Michel de Nostredame, a physician who stood against the Black Death, snatching souls from the very clutches of the plague, an astrologer who, in the dead of night, peered into the dark, still waters of a copper bowl until the fires of centuries yet to come began to burn within them. A poet who encrypted the history of humanity into 1,000 nebulous quatrains, but who, in reality, was this man? A man eternally haunted by his own visions, by the creeping fear of the Inquisition, and by the shadows of the dead? This is the chronicle of his path. It tells of how a gifted healer, incapable of saving his own wife and children from the plague, transformed into the most enigmatic prophet in history. It will recount his dangerous game with the Black Queen, Catherine de' Medici, his life lived on the very edge of the pyre, and how he saw, written in the stars, the death of a king, a prophecy fulfilled with terrifying precision. It is the narrative of the creation of a book that has been cursed and revered across 5 centuries, of the long, solitary nights in the tower of the city of Ceylon, of secret codes, and of the crushing burden of knowing that which has not yet come to pass. This is not merely a tale of magic or prophecy. It is the story of a profound human tragedy, an attempt to outwit destiny itself, and a revelation of the true price of a gift that allows a man to see through the veil of time, yet grants him absolutely no power to change a single thing. The story of the man who would see the future began in a place where the past was everywhere. Michel de Nostredame was born on December 14th, 1503, in the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, in the south of France. This region, bathed in sunlight and battered by the Mistral wind, was always a crossroads of cultures, where the ruins of Roman civilization mingled with the mysticism of the Middle Ages. But the most important factor in Michel's birth was not the place. It was blood. Behind the sonorous French surname de Nostredame, which means of Our Lady, hid a dangerous secret. His family belonged to Jewish converts. Both of his grandfathers, on his father's and mother's sides, had been forced to adopt Catholicism barely half a century before Michel's birth to avoid exile or the confiscation of their property by decree of King Louis XII. They were New Christians, or Marranos. In the eyes of the church and their neighbors, these people always remained under suspicion. It was believed that behind closed doors they secretly continued to profess the faith of their ancestors, and in the case of the Nostradamus family, this suspicion likely had foundation. Michel grew up in a house where outward Catholic piety was combined with a profound and secret knowledge of ancient Jewish traditions, the Kabbalah, and mysticism. It was precisely his origin that defined his destiny. Jews in Provence traditionally engaged in 2 professions, commerce and medicine. Michel's ancestors were physicians who treated dukes and kings. They were the intellectual elite, guardians of knowledge that was inaccessible to the majority of Europeans. The education of the young Michel was not undertaken by his parents, but by his 2 extraordinary grandfathers, Jean de Saint-Rémy and Pierre de Nostredame. They saw in the boy not only a lively mind, but a phenomenal, almost frightening memory. He could quote entire chapters of books, having read them only once. The grandfathers decided to pass on to him everything they knew. It was an education one could not even dream of in ordinary schools. Jean de Saint-Rémy, who had been the personal physician to King René the Good, taught his grandson not only Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He opened up the world of celestial science to him. At night, they would climb to the roof, and the old man would teach the boy to read the starry sky. To them, astronomy and astrology were not different sciences, but a single whole. The movement of the planets was not simple mechanics, but the language of God, with the help of which one could understand the causes of diseases and the destiny of nations. It was there, on the rooftops of Provence, that the young Michel first learned to seek answers in the stars. Besides the stars, they taught him the mysteries of herbs and plants. His grandfathers transmitted to him the secrets of alchemy and pharmacy, how to mix poisons and antidotes, how to distill essences, how to use the force of nature to heal. He grew up in an atmosphere where magic was simply a science not yet understood, and ancient books were considered the source of supreme truth. In 1518, at the age of 15, Michel left home to enter the University of Avignon. It was his first step into the great world. Avignon, the former residence of the popes, was the center of theology and scholasticism. But Michel stood out among the students. He was not interested in theological disputes, but in natural philosophy. He openly supported the heretical theory of Copernicus that the earth revolves around the sun, which caused shock among the professors and admiration among his peers. They nicknamed him the Little Astrologer. His memory was so phenomenal that he could declaim huge fragments of the works of ancient philosophers by heart without looking at the text. However, his studies in Avignon lasted only a year. A force intervened that would become the principal enemy and companion of Nostradamus throughout his life: the plague. The epidemic broke out in the city, and the university was closed. The students dispersed. Instead of returning home to safety, Michel chose a different path. The next 8 years, from 1521 to 1529, he spent wandering throughout the south of France. It was a period that historians call his years of apprenticeship, although he did not learn from books but from practice. He became a wandering apothecary. He collected herbs, studied folk remedies, and associated with alchemists, healers, and possibly prescribed Kabbalists. He wanted to understand the nature of diseases not through the dry theories of Galen, but through living experience. In 1529, having accumulated experience and money, he entered the famous University of Montpellier, the oldest and most prestigious medical school in France. He was already 26 years old, much older and more experienced than most of the students. And here occurred a conflict that vividly characterizes his personality. Doctors of that era were theorists. They delivered lectures in Latin while sitting at the podium, whereas the dirty work, autopsies, bloodletting, the preparation of medicines, was done by barbers and apothecaries. Doctors considered themselves the elite, and apothecaries as artisans, as servants. Michel de Nostredame, upon entering the faculty, did not hide his past. He spoke openly of his experiments with medicines. He criticized the professors for being disconnected from reality, and he disputed dogmas. Moreover, in the archives of the University of Montpellier, a document is preserved proving that they attempted to expel the student Michel de Nostredame. The reason was formal, but revealing. He engaged in manual labor. He had been an apothecary, which was forbidden by the statutes for future doctors, and he indulged in insolent speeches directed at the professors. He had to justify himself and prove that his experience as an apothecary was an advantage, not a disgrace. His intelligence and charisma won out. Not only was he readmitted, but he finished his studies, receiving the degree of Doctor of Medicine. He donned the doctoral gown and the square cap, obtaining the official right to heal. But he did not become an ordinary doctor who prescribes bloodletting for every illness. He was the bearer of a unique alloy of knowledge, the academic medicine of Montpellier, the secret wisdom of his Jewish ancestors, and the practical experience of a wandering herbalist. He was ready to face his main enemy, the Black Death. And in this battle, he would use methods that to his contemporaries seemed like madness, but to us today, seem like the first flashes of modern hygiene and pharmacology. Thus, around the age of 30, Michel de Nostredame had formed as an individual. He was a scientist who believed in the stars. He was a doctor who despised ancient methods. And he was a man with a secret in his blood, who always felt that this world has a more complex structure than what is written in the books of the Church. In the 1530s, France trembled once again. The Black Death had returned. The bubonic plague, which a century and a half earlier had annihilated half the population of Europe, had never truly left. It returned in waves, turning prosperous cities into cemeteries. For the people of that era, it was not a medical phenomenon, but the wrath of God, a punishment for sins from which there was no salvation. 16th century medicine was powerless. Doctors, following the teachings of the ancients, believed the disease was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, or by miasmas, poisonous vapors from the earth. Their treatment methods were barbaric and often killed the patient faster than the disease itself. They bled weakened patients. They applied red-hot iron, dried toads, or leeches to the buboes, swollen lymph nodes. They gave the sick mercury and arsenic to drink. Doctors walked around wearing the famous beak-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, believing the smell would protect them from contagion. But in reality, they were merely registrars of death. Into this hell, the young Dr. Michel de Nostredame entered voluntarily. After obtaining his degree at Montpellier, he did not stay to teach. He became a wandering physician specializing in the plague. When news arrived of an epidemic outbreak in a city, most doctors fled along with the wealthy citizens. Nostradamus, on the contrary, went toward it. He traveled through the south of France, from Bordeaux to Toulouse, from Carcassonne to Agen, appearing in the very epicenters of the contagion. His approach was revolutionary. He was one of the first in history to intuit the principles of asepsis and hygiene, even though the discovery of microbes was still 300 years away. He categorically forbade bloodletting under threat of refusing to treat the patient. He understood that blood loss only weakened a body that was already fighting the infection with its last ounce of strength. He renounced cruel cauterizations and poisonous potions. Instead, he prescribed what his colleagues considered charlatanism: fresh air, clean water, the immediate removal of corpses from the streets, and most importantly, the frequent changing of bed linens and clothing. He demanded that the floors of the sick rooms be washed with vinegar and that the air be purified by burning aromatic herbs. Without knowing the exact mechanism, he was destroying the carriers of the disease, fleas and rats, and creating an environment where bacteria died. But Nostradamus's main weapon, his miracle cure about which all of France whispered, were his famous rose pills. He carried them with him in leather pouches and distributed them to both the sick and the healthy. The composition of these pills was not magic. It was pharmaceutical genius. Nostradamus, utilizing the knowledge of his herbalist ancestors, mixed crushed red rose petals, green cypress sawdust, iris, cloves, aloe, and aromatic calamus. He mixed all this with rose juice and formed small pellets that were to be held in the mouth without swallowing. From the point of view of modern science, it was a potent vitamin bomb. Rose hips and roses contain an enormous dose of vitamin C, which drastically strengthened the immune system. Cypress and cloves possess strong antiseptic properties. Aloe is a natural antibiotic. By keeping the pill in the mouth, a person constantly disinfected their mucous membranes and received support for their immune system. In a world where people suffered from avitaminosis and filth, this simple remedy acted like magic. People who took Nostradamus's pills survived far more often than the patients of other doctors. The fame of the miracle doctor who did not fear death and healed with flowers, ran ahead of him. City magistrates invited him, offering enormous sums of money. In 1546, when the plague struck the city of Aix-en-Provence, the city council officially hired Nostradamus as the chief medical officer. The situation in Aix was catastrophic. People were dying so fast, there was no one left to sew the burial shrouds. Nostradamus worked in the city for 270 days. He did not just heal. He organized a system of quarantine and street cleaning. He forced citizens to remove the garbage rotting on the roads. At the end of the epidemic, as a token of gratitude for saving the city, the Parliament of Provence granted him a lifelong pension, an extremely rare honor for a physician. But his success was not due solely to medicines. Nostradamus possessed a very powerful charisma. Tall, with a thick beard and piercing eyes, he instilled in the sick a faith in healing. He touched them, spoke with them. He showed no fear. In an era when fear killed as effectively as the disease, his confidence was a medicine in itself. During this period of his life, he befriended one of the most brilliant minds of his time, Julius Caesar Scaliger. Scaliger was a philosopher, physician, and humanist who lived in the city of Agen. He invited Nostradamus to his home. For Michel, it was an intellectual refuge. In Scaliger's library, they discussed ancient philosophy, new discoveries, and the secrets of nature for hours. Scaliger called Nostradamus one of the finest minds in France. It seemed that life had settled down. Nostradamus was rich, famous, and respected. He decided to settle in Agen. He married a young woman from a good family. Her exact name is unknown. Some sources call her Henriette. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Michel, who was already past 30, had finally found a home, a family, and peace. He was sure he had beaten destiny. He believed his knowledge and experience were capable of protecting his loved ones from any misfortune. But he was wrong. Destiny, which he had outwitted so successfully in other people's cities, arrived at the threshold of his own home. The plague, which had receded for a time, returned to Agen with renewed force, and this time it had a specific target. The greatest physician of his time, the man who saved Aix and Lyon, the man who knew the secret of the rose pills, found himself facing a test that would destroy his life to its very foundations and transform the successful doctor into a somber prophet. The year 1534 should have been the year of triumph for Michel de Nostredame. He was happy in his marriage. His 2 children, a boy and a girl, were growing up healthy. His medical practice in Agen was thriving, and his friendship with the great Scaliger opened the doors to high society. He believed he had fortune on his side. But the Black Death, against which he had fought so successfully in other cities, proved to be more cunning. It returned to Agen, and this time it struck not an anonymous crowd, but the very heart of his world. The epidemic broke out suddenly. Nostradamus, as always, rushed to save the citizens, but upon returning home one night, he discovered the symptoms of the disease in his wife and children. It was the moment of truth for the physician. The man who had saved thousands of strangers with his rose pills and his hygiene now stood by the bedside of his most beloved, and his hands trembled. He applied all his knowledge, gave them the best medicines, disinfected the air, and did not sleep for nights on end. But the disease was stronger. First, his wife died. After her, one by one, his children were extinguished. For Nostradamus, that was not just a personal collapse. It was his professional and spiritual end. The inhabitants of Agen, who until yesterday had idolized him, now looked at him with horror and contempt. The whispers behind his back were worse than a scream. "Physician, heal thyself." If he could not save his own family, it meant his medicines were a lie. Or worse, it meant he was cursed by God. In the eyes of the superstitious citizens, the death of the doctor's family was a divine sign. His clientele vanished instantly. Patients crossed the street upon seeing him. But that was only the beginning of his fall. His late wife's family, instead of showing compassion, filed a lawsuit against him. They demanded the immediate return of the dowry, since, after the death of his wife and children, he had no right to the inheritance.
A humiliating trial began that left him without his last savings. The cruelest blow was dealt by his best friend and mentor, Julius Caesar Scaliger. This brilliant intellectual was an arrogant man, intolerant of failure. Seeing Nostradamus' reputation destroyed, he publicly disowned him. He declared that friendship with a charlatan who could not save his own children stained his own name. The doors of the house where Michel had been happy were closed to him forever. And finally, the Inquisition awoke. Until that moment, his fame as a savior had protected Nostradamus from the attacks of the church, which always looked with suspicion upon the Jewish doctor who dabbled in astrology. But now, he was defenseless. They remembered an old incident. Once, passing by a statue of the Virgin Mary that an artisan was casting, Nostradamus supposedly remarked sarcastically that the man was creating demons. It was a joke about the aesthetic quality of the statue, but now it was interpreted as blasphemy and proof of his secret Judaism or Lutheranism. In 1538, the Inquisitor of Toulouse summoned him for interrogation. Nostradamus understood. To stay meant to die. He gathered his few belongings, mounted a mule, and abandoned Agen under the cover of night. The most mysterious and obscure period of his life began. 6 years of wandering, about which we know very little. From 1538 to 1544, he disappeared from official radars. He became a vagabond, a wandering Jew, a pilgrim without a destination. He crossed all of France, reached Italy, was in Lorraine, and possibly Germany. It was not a journey across the geographical map, but across the map of secret knowledge. Disappointed by official medicine that had not saved his loved ones, he began to seek answers elsewhere. He visited secret laboratories of alchemists in Venice and Milan. He met with Kabbalists, who taught him that the visible world is only a shell, beneath which the true springs of existence are hidden. He studied the properties of forbidden plants and minerals. It was precisely in these years of wandering that his transformation began. The physician was dying. The prophet was being born. He began to notice strange things within himself, sudden flashes of intuition, dreams that came true, sensations of déjà vu in places he had never been. One of the most famous and astonishing legends about Nostradamus is connected to this period, which, if true, proves that his gift of clairvoyance opened up right then. Traveling through Italy, in the region of Ancona, Nostradamus met a group of young Franciscan monks on the road. Suddenly, he stopped, dismounted from his mule, and fell to his knees before one of them, a young, unremarkable monk named Felice Peretti, who in the past had been a simple swineherd. Nostradamus's companions and the monks themselves were in shock. They asked him why he was bowing before a simple brother. Nostradamus, without raising his head, replied, "I must kneel before His Holiness." Everyone took him for a madman. But 40 years later, in 1585, long after Nostradamus was dead, that same monk, Felice Peretti, was elected pope and took the name Sixtus V. This prophecy became the first link in the chain of his legendary fame. In 1544, Nostradamus decided to return to France. He had changed. He was no longer that young, cheerful, and self-assured doctor. He had become a closed and severe man,
with a heavy gaze that had seen too much death and pain. He settled in Marseille and then, in 1546, once again participated in the fight against the plague in Aix, where he definitively restored his reputation as a doctor. But medicine was no longer the meaning of his life. It was a trade to earn money. His soul now lived in another dimension. He sought a place where he could stop, lock himself away from the world, and try to understand those visions that were breaking into his consciousness with increasing frequency and insistence. He needed a tower.
In 1547, he arrived in the small town of Salon de Provence. There he met a wealthy widow, Anne Ponsardet, whom he married. It was a marriage of convenience that gave him financial independence and a house in whose attic he would set up his secret study. The wanderer had finally found refuge. The period of exile was over. Nostradamus was ready to begin his main work, a work that would make kings tremble and that, 500 years later, would continue to frighten people all over the world. He was preparing to write the history of the future. In the small town of Salon de Provence, in the mid-16th century, life flowed slowly from one harvest to the next. The locals knew Michel de Nostredame as a respectable, though slightly strange, physician who had made a fortunate marriage to a wealthy widow, Anne Ponsard, and started a new family. By day, he led the normal life of a bourgeois. He engaged in commerce, invested money in irrigation canals, and manufactured cosmetics and jams. His treatise on preserves and cosmetics became a bestseller of the era. But as darkness fell, when the town slept, another life began in the Nostradamus household. At the very top of his house, under the roof, he set up a secret study. Entry was forbidden to everyone, even his wife. He turned this room into an observatory and a magical laboratory. The shelves groaned under the weight of ancient folios in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, books for the mere possession of which one could end up at the stake. There were astrolabes, armillary spheres, braziers, and mysterious vessels. It was precisely here, for many years, every night, that a ritual took place, which Nostradamus himself described in the first 2 quatrains of his Prophecies. It was not a scientific observation. It was an act of summoning visions. He would sit on a 3-legged copper chair, a tripod similar to the one used by the Pythia, the prophetess of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Before him was a bowl of water. In complete silence, by the light of a single candle, he would fall into a deep trance. He would stare into the water until the surface began to cloud over and images appeared in it. In his hand, he held a laurel branch with which he sprinkled water and inhaled the vapors rising from the bowl. He described this state as a physical torture. His body trembled, his voice changed, becoming alien and muffled. "A slender flame, coming from the solitude, makes me prophesy," he wrote. He believed that in those moments, his mind left his body and connected to a divine source, to the flow of time where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. What he saw was not a clear film about the future. It was flashes, fragments of nightmares, scraps of sentences, the smell of burning and blood. He saw falling towers, iron birds launching fire from the sky, mushroom-shaped clouds, kings with their throats cut, plagues and famines. It was chaos. The visions struck him in waves, provoking terror. He did not always understand exactly what he saw. He saw strange machines and the flags of states that did not yet exist. His task was to translate these abstract and surreal images into the language of words. And here, his second and primary fear came into play: the fear of the Inquisition.
Nostradamus understood perfectly that he was walking on a razor's edge. In the eyes of the church, the line between a prophet, to whom God reveals the future, and a sorcerer who receives knowledge from the devil was practically invisible. His Jewish origin made him a perfect target. If he had written in plain text, "In 1789 in France they will overthrow the king and execute him," he would have been burned the next day as a heretic and an agitator. That is why he made the decision to encrypt his visions. He created a unique and obscure language, a code that, he hoped, only the initiated of the future could decipher. He wrote in quatrains, 4-line stanzas, but these verses had no rhyme or meter in the usual sense. It was a stream of consciousness. He mixed Old French with Latin, Greek, Provençal dialect, and Hebrew. He used anagrams, rearranging the letters of names, synecdoche, naming the part for the whole, and complex astrological metaphors. He intentionally violated chronology. The quatrains were shuffled like a deck of cards. A prophecy about the year 1999 could be next to a prediction about events of the 16th century. He destroyed all temporal references.
"I have obscured my prophecies," he wrote in the dedication to his son Caesar, "so as not to enrage the rulers of the present." It was a survival strategy. The book had to seem like a collection of poetic and nebulous ravings so that no inquisitor could accuse him of a specific heresy. But at the same time, it had to contain enough detail so that when the event occurred, people would understand. He had seen it. Before publishing his main work, Nostradamus decided to test the waters. Starting in 1550, he began publishing annual almanacs. These were calendars with predictions of weather, harvests, and general political events for the year. The almanacs were a deafening success. People living in an age of uncertainty yearned to know the future. Nostradamus became a celebrity. Merchants and farmers bought his pamphlets at fairs to know when to plant wheat or send out ships. These pilot tests showed him the public was ready, and most importantly, they brought him money and protection. The name of Nostradamus became known at court. In 1555, in Lyon, the first edition of his main book, The Prophecies of Master Michel Nostradamus, was published, containing the first 3 centuries, hundreds of verses. The reaction was instantaneous and polarized. Educated humanists and poets like Ronsard admired his enigmatic style, calling him the new oracle. The common people bought the book, frightened by the misfortunes to come. But the clergy and many medical colleagues were furious. They called him a drunkard, a charlatan, a madman selling lies. In the streets of Ceylon, he was sometimes insulted, and at night, someone would paint gallows on the doors of his house. The book described the image of a world doomed to endless wars, cataclysms, and suffering. Nostradamus was not an optimist. He saw history as a series of cycles of destruction. He predicted the arrival of 3 antichrists. The first, researchers would later identify as Napoleon, whom he called Pau Ne Laurent, an anagram of Napoleon Roy, Napoleon the King. The second as Hitler, whom he called Hister, which means Danube, but sounds very similar. And the third, whose name is Mabus, and whose arrival will mark the end of times. The world still awaits. But among hundreds of nebulous and incomprehensible verses, there was one that stood out for its terrifying specificity. It was quatrain 35 of the 1st century. It spoke of a young lion who would overcome the old one in a golden cage, piercing his eye. No one in 1555 could understand what it was about. It seemed like a beautiful metaphor, but that quatrain was destined to be fatal. It was precisely this verse that turned the provincial author of almanacs into a man whom kings feared. The book reached Paris, into the hands of the most powerful woman in France,
Queen Catherine de' Medici, and she, upon reading that quatrain, felt the chill of the tomb. She understood it was about her husband, King Henry II.
The publication of the Prophecies in 1555 provoked a storm of ridicule among scholars, but it achieved its main objective. It reached the hands of the one person in France whose opinion mattered. The book appeared on the desk of Queen Catherine de' Medici. Catherine was a sinister and tragic figure, an Italian from the infamous Florentine lineage of bankers and poisoners, the niece of popes. She brought to France not only the fork and the fashion of high heels, but also a deep-seated hereditary passion for the occult. At the French court, she felt like an outsider. Her husband, King Henry II, openly despised her, preferring the company of his favorite, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine, humiliated and alone, sought protection in dark forces. She surrounded herself with astrologers, magicians, and soothsayers. Upon seeing Nostradamus's almanacs and then his centuries, she felt in them a force that her courtly flatterers did not possess. She was particularly unsettled by one quatrain. Century 1, verse 35. It read, "The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in a single combat. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage slash. 2 wounds made 1. Then he dies a cruel death." Catherine, who always feared for her husband's life, saw in this a direct warning. In 1556, she summoned Nostradamus to Paris. For the provincial doctor, it was a moment of supreme triumph and mortal danger. The journey across all of France took a month. Nostradamus traveled in fear. He did not know if a reward or the gallows awaited him. If his predictions displeased the king, they could accuse him of witchcraft. Furthermore, he was tormented by gout, turning every movement into an ordeal. Upon arriving in Paris on August 15th, 1556, he was immediately received by the Queen. The meeting took place behind closed doors. What they spoke of remains a secret. But it is known that Catherine asked questions not only about her husband, but also about the destiny of her children. She had 7 surviving children and fanatically wished to know their future. Nostradamus, displaying miraculous diplomacy, told her the truth, but wrapped in a beautiful package. He predicted that 3 of her sons would be kings. To a mother, that sounded like a great blessing. Her dynasty would rule forever. But the prophet withheld the second part of the vision. For 3 sons to be kings, one after another, they had to die one after another, without leaving heirs. He predicted the rise of the Valois dynasty, but in his silence hid the prediction of its total extinction. The Queen was satisfied. She showered Nostradamus with gifts and gave him the title of physician and royal counselor. However, King Henry II treated the old man's predictions with skepticism. He was a warrior, a man in the prime of life who did not believe in old wives' tales about lions and cages. Nostradamus returned to Salon, but the shadow of his prophecy remained floating over Paris. The denouement came 3 years later, in the summer of 1559. A festive atmosphere reigned in Paris. France and Spain had signed the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis, ending the long Italian wars. To seal the alliance, 2 weddings were organized. Henry's daughter was marrying the King of Spain, and his sister was marrying the Duke of Savoy. In honor of this event, the king organized a grandiose jousting tournament on the Rue Saint-Antoine. Tournaments were Henry II's favorite entertainment. He was 40 years old, strong, athletic, and eager to show his valor before his subjects, and, above all, before his beloved Diane. The tournament lasted 3 days. The king personally participated in the jousts, taking to the lists under banners of black and white, the colors of Diane de Poitiers, which was a public humiliation for Queen Catherine. He won several victories. On the 3rd day, June 30th, When the tournament was already drawing to a close, the king, heated by the combat, noticed that not all the lances had yet been broken. He wanted one last joust. He challenged the Comte de Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard. Montgomery was a young and strong knight. He tried to refuse, arguing that the tournament was over and the sun was already setting, blinding the eyes. Queen Catherine, tormented by bad premonitions, legend says she had dreamed of her husband's fall, begged Henry to stop. But the king was stubborn. He ordered Montgomery to put on his helmet and take up the lance. That was the moment when history and prophecy collided head-on. Let us recall the quatrain. The young lion will overcome the older one. The Comte de Montgomery, the young lion, was several years younger than the king, the old lion. Moreover, on Montgomery's shield, according to some heraldic sources, there was a lion. On the field of combat, in a single combat. A joust is precisely a ritualized single combat, an imitation of battle. The riders spurred their horses. A terrible crack was heard. The lances struck the shields and shattered. It was a strong blow. Both remained in the saddle, but by a fatal destiny, Montgomery failed to throw away the fragment of his lance in time. The sharp, splintered piece of wood slid upward along the king's armor. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. King Henry wore a luxurious gilded helmet with a visor. The visor was a grid, a golden cage. The sharp splinter of Montgomery's lance entered exactly through the slit of the visor, pierced through and lodged in the king's right eye, penetrating deep into the brain. The king, swaying, collapsed onto the neck of his horse and then to the ground. The crowd gasped. They tore off his helmet. The spectacle was horrific. Splinters of wood protruded from his eye and temple. His face was bathed in blood. 2 wounds made one, then he dies a cruel death. The lance caused 2 injuries. It pierced the eye and damaged the brain, or throat, according to another version. They carried the unconscious king to the Hôtel des Tournelles. An agony began that lasted 10 interminable days. The best doctors in Europe, including the great anatomist Vesalius, were summoned to the dying man's bedside. They could do nothing. To understand how to extract the fragments, on the Queen's orders, they had 4 criminals beheaded and drove lances into their eyes at the same angle, imitating the wound. But not even that cruel investigation helped. The king died in monstrous torment, losing his reason from the pain, screaming and cursing everyone. On July 10th, 1559, Henry II passed away. The king's death shocked France, but an even greater shock was caused by the precision with which it had been described in a book published 4 years before the event. The coincidence was absolute, mathematically exact. Golden cage, eye, 2 wounds, cruel death. All the details converged. Overnight, the name of Nostradamus became the most spoken in Europe. Booksellers could not keep up with printing new editions of the centuries. People in panic searched the book for new predictions, believing this man knew everything. But for the prophet himself, it was a moment of terror. He understood what had happened. The Parisians, maddened by grief over the loss of their king, gathered before the palace. The crowd demanded blood. They shouted that the sorcerer of Salon must be burned. They believed he had not only predicted the death, but had invoked it, that he had placed a curse on the king with his quatrain. The Inquisition began to prepare the case. Nostradamus's life hung by a thread. He was saved only by the Black Queen. Catherine de' Medici, now regent for her sickly son Francis II, took power into her hands. She remembered that Nostradamus had warned her. To her, he was not an assassin, but the only person who did not lie. She took him publicly under her protection, declaring he was a servant of God, possessing the gift of providence. The death of Henry II was a turning point, not only for Nostradamus, but for all of France. The strong royal power collapsed. The era of Catherine's weak sons began, an era of chaos, religious wars, and blood that Nostradamus had also seen in his bowl of water. The fulfilled prophecy became his curse. Now he was condemned to see the doom of those who protected him, knowing he had no power to change anything. After the tragic death of Henry II, France plunged into the chaos that Nostradamus had predicted in his darkest quatrains. The golden age of the Renaissance was over. The era of the wars of religion began. The country split into two irreconcilable camps: the Catholics, loyal to the Pope and the King, and the Protestant Huguenots, who demanded reforms. Hatred hung in the air. Neighbors killed neighbors. Fanatics on both sides called for massacre. In this boiling cauldron, Michel de Nostredame found himself in the most dangerous position. He was the personal counselor and astrologer to the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, who de facto ruled the country in the name of her weak sons. But proximity to the throne did not provide him with security. On the contrary, it made him a target. Catholic priests hated him, calling him an envoy of Satan and remembering his Jewish roots. They claimed his prophecies were the whispers of demons. The Huguenots hated him even more, considering him a servant of the whore of Babylon, papal Rome, and Catherine de' Medici's black magician. In 1561, when religious riots reached Ceylon, a mob of Catholic fanatics almost broke into his house to kill him for supposedly not attending Mass. Nostradamus had to flee and hide in Avignon until tempers cooled. But the heaviest burden he carried was not before the crowd, but before the Queen. Catherine de' Medici, obsessed with the fate of her dynasty, demanded the truth from him. She took him with her across all of France during the grand tour of the royal court, forcing him to cast horoscopes for each of her children. And what Nostradamus saw was terrible. He saw the curse of the Valois. The dynasty that had ruled France for 200 years was dying out before his eyes. The eldest son, Francis II, died just a year after his father from an ear infection, or, as was whispered, from poison. He was 16 years old. The next king, Charles IX, was a mentally unstable youth, prone to fits of rage and manipulated by his mother. Nostradamus saw that his time would also be short, and that his reign would be bathed in blood. The most famous and dramatic episode of this period occurred in 1564, when the royal court visited the castle in Béarn. There, the young Henry of Navarre was being raised, a distant relative of the king's, a prince of the blood, but a Huguenot. He was a lively, dirty boy who ran around the castle. Nostradamus, upon seeing him, asked that the child be brought to him. He examined him. According to legend, he even asked that he be undressed to see his birthmarks, and then, turning to the retinue, pronounced a prophecy that sounded like a death sentence for Catherine's sons. "Behold, he who will inherit it all. He will outlive them all and will rule France." To say that to the face of the reigning king's mother was madness. It meant that all her sons, Charles, Henry, Francis, would die without issue. But Catherine, paradoxically, believed him so much that she did not execute him for his insolence. She accepted it as destiny. The prophecy came true. Years later, Henry of Navarre would become Henry IV, one of the greatest kings of France and founder of the Bourbon dynasty. Nostradamus saw not only the fate of kings, he saw the fate of France. In his Centuries, there are many verses that describe the Civil War, the great city bathed in blood, and a massacre perpetrated at night. Historians see in these lines an exact description of the impending St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when Catholics would slaughter thousands of Huguenots in Paris. Imagine the psychological state of a man who sees a train coming but is tied to the rails. He knew what would happen. He wrote about it. But he understood the futility of his warnings. People read his almanacs, were frightened, but continued to do what their hatred dictated.
"I write in a cloudy manner," he confessed in his letters, "because if I told them the truth directly, they would not believe me, and they would kill me." Prophecy could not change the future. It could only bear witness to its inevitability. By 1564, Nostradamus was already an old man. He had passed 60, a venerable age for the time. His health, undermined by years of wandering and fighting the plague, was collapsing. He suffered from a severe form of gout that developed into dropsy and heart failure. His legs swelled, every movement caused him infernal pain. He struggled to climb the stairs to his observatory, but even in that state, he remained an object of adoration and hatred. When the royal court arrived in his hometown of Salon de Provence, it was his stellar moment. The Queen Mother, the young King Charles IX, and the entire brilliant court came to the threshold of his modest house to pay their respects. The city magistrates, who until recently had allowed gallows to be painted on his doors, now bowed to the ground before him. The king granted him the title of counselor and physician in ordinary, with an enormous salary. Nostradamus accepted the honors with a weary irony. He knew the value of the crowd. "Today they shout Hosanna, and tomorrow they will shout Crucify him." He knew his fame rested solely on Catherine de' Medici's protection. If she died or turned her back on him, the Inquisition would come for him the next day. His final years were spent working on the completion of the Centuries. He managed to write 10 centuries, though the 7th remained incomplete while battling his illness. He felt his time was running out. He began to prepare for death as methodically as he prepared his medicines. He drew up a detailed will, distributing his considerable fortune, some 3,444 gold écus, between his wife and children, but with one strict condition. His sons were not to engage in medicine or astrology. He wanted to protect them from his curse. He did not want them to bear the same cross of knowledge and fear. In his visions, he probably also saw his own end. He knew the date, and he knew that even after death, they would not leave him in peace. The darkness around his figure thickened. The rumors that he communicated with the devil grew stronger as his somber predictions came true. People were afraid to pass by his house at night, claiming they saw an unnatural, infernal light in the tower window. The curse of the prophet lay in absolute solitude. He lived in a world where no one, not even his own family, could understand what went through his head during his nocturnal trances. He saw cities of the future burning, the fall of empires not yet born, and weapons not yet invented. And he had to take these secrets to the grave, leaving the world only a set of encrypted riddles in a mixture of 4 languages. In the summer of 1566, Nostradamus felt the end was near. His body was failing. The dropsy reached his chest. He struggled to breathe. He stopped climbing to his tower. Now his universe had contracted to the size of an armchair by the fireplace, where he spent sleepless nights trying to breathe. But his mind remained clear to the last second. He was preparing to make his final, most precise, and most personal prediction. At the end of June 1566, Michel de Nostredame understood that his earthly path had ended. He was 62 years old, and his body had definitively surrendered. Dropsy, the accumulation of fluid in the tissues due to heart failure, had turned his life into a continuous torture. His legs and abdomen were swollen. Every movement caused him to gasp for breath. He could no longer lie down, because in a horizontal position, he began to suffocate. He spent the last weeks of his life sitting in an armchair or on a special bench built for him. But his mind, that very instrument that allowed him to travel through the centuries, remained crystal clear. He observed his own agony with the same cold, analytical interest of a physician with which he had once observed the victims of the plague. He knew the symptoms. He knew the outcome. And, as legends claim, he knew the exact hour. On June 17th, he summoned the notary Joseph Roche to dictate his will. It was not the document of a mystic, but of a pragmatic and solicitous family man. He scrupulously detailed his fortune down to the last sou, a small coin, amounting to the considerable sum of 3,444 gold écus. He provided for his daughter's dowries, his son's education, and a comfortable old age for his widow. But in that will, there was a strange clause. He asked to be buried not in the earth, but in the wall of the church of the Lesser Franciscans in Ceylon, in an upright position. It is believed he did not want some idiot to trample on his bones. Even in death, he wanted to remain untouchable and above the crowd. The day of his death, July 1st, 1566, began as usual. Nostradamus, overcoming the pain, put his papers in order. In the evening, his faithful student and secretary, Jean de Chavigny, came to see him.
He saw that the master had worsened, and upon leaving said, "Until tomorrow, master." Nostradamus looked at him with his heavy, tired gaze and uttered the phrase that would become his last and most precise prophecy. "Tomorrow at sunrise, you will not find me alive." It was not the moan of a sick man. It was the statement of a fact. He knew the schedule. Chavigny left, worried but hoping for the best. Nostradamus remained alone in his room. What did he do in those final hours? Did he pray to the God in whom he sincerely believed? Or did he try one last time to look into the abyss of the future? We will never know. It is only known that he removed his famous medallion with a mysterious engraving, which he had worn for many years, and placed it on the table. He was ready. On the morning of July 2nd, when the first rays of the sun touched the rooftops of Ceylon, the secretary and family members entered his room. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Michel de Nostredame was dead. He lay on the floor, near his bench and his bed, having been unable or unwilling to lie down. The great physician, victor of the plague, counselor to kings, and herald of destiny, had departed, just as he had predicted. His funeral was solemn, but took place in an atmosphere of superstitious fear. The citizens of Ceylon, who in his lifetime had painted gallows on his doors, now bid him farewell as if he were a saint, fearing his posthumous wrath. His body, according to his will, was immured in the church of the Cordeliers. On the marble slab his widow had an inscription engraved. Here rest the bones of the celebrated Michel de Nostredame, the only one of all mortals worthy of recording with his almost divine pen, thanks to the influence of the stars, the future events of the whole world. But not even death brought him peace. The legends that surrounded him in life turned into a veritable mythology after his passing. It was said he was buried with a golden key in his mouth, or that he was buried sitting up with the Book of Prophecies on his knees and a lit lamp that was to go out only when the tomb was opened. The most famous and macabre story related to his tomb occurred 200 years later, during the French Revolution. In 1791, revolutionary soldiers, drunk on atheism and the thirst for plunder, broke into the church in Ceylon. They knew the legend that his coffin contained gold or secret manuscripts. The Vandals broke the marble slab and opened the sarcophagus. Inside, they found a skeleton. On the neck or chest of the skeleton was a copper medallion. When one of the soldiers, laughing, picked it up,
he saw a date engraved on it: 1791. Nostradamus had predicted the year of the desecration of his own tomb. Legend says the soldiers recoiled in horror, but one of them, the most drunk and daring, decided to challenge the old sorcerer. Remembering another legend, that whoever drank wine from Nostradamus's skull would inherit his gift, he grabbed the skull, poured wine into it, and drank. In the next instant, a stray bullet or a stone fragment from a street skirmish entered the church and killed him on the spot. The prophecy of desecration was instantly fulfilled. Of course, this is a legend, but it shows how strong the fear of that name was, even centuries later. In reality, Nostradamus's remains were saved by the mayor of the city, who secretly reburied the bones in the chapel of the Virgin Mary, where they rest to this day. So, what is his true legacy? The Centuries of Nostradamus became the most published book in the world after the Bible. Never, not for a single year in 500 years, have they ceased to be printed. Each generation has found in his nebulous lines the reflection of its own fears. In the 17th century, they saw in them the prediction of the execution of the English King Charles I. In the 18th, the French Revolution.
In the 20th century, his name was used as a propaganda weapon. The wife of Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister of Nazi Germany, read Nostradamus before bed and convinced her husband that the prophet had predicted the victory of the Third Reich. The Allies responded in kind, airdropping false quatrains over Germany that predicted Hitler's defeat. In his verses, they have found mentions of Napoleon, Hitler, Kennedy, Saddam Hussein. The lines about fire from the sky, iron birds, and mushrooms were interpreted as predictions of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and the attacks of September 11th. Skeptics claim this is the effect of retrospective prophecy. The verses are so vague that any event can be fitted to them after it has happened. That it is not foresight, but a mirror in which we see what we want to see. But even skeptics admit one thing. Michel de Nostredame was a phenomenon. A doctor who was ahead of the medicine of his time, a poet who created his own hypnotic language, and a man who managed to make all of humanity believe that history has a script. Was he a charlatan? Perhaps. Was he a prophet? Millions believe so. But above all, he was a profoundly tragic figure. A man who looked at the stars not to find happiness there, but to find an explanation for the endless sufferings of the human race, of which he was a witness. In the last quatrain attributed to him, though its authorship is disputed, it is said, "Let those who read these verses meditate upon them maturely. Let the profane and ignorant crowd not touch them. And cursed be he who disturbs the rest of my ashes." Nostradamus took his main secret to the grave. He left us only questions to which each new century gives its own, new, and terrifying answer.